Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you all in this online format. I'm happy to be virtually at the Belgrade Security Forum in Belgrade. And I'm very happy to have with me two very important experts on the questions of democracy, Ivan Krastev and Thomas Carothers. It's my pleasure to lead through this discussion. We will have an hour together and we will spend the first 45 minutes on the panel, I with my guests Ivan and Thomas, discussing the question saving democracy, cooperation and solidarity in the aftermath of the pandemic. And I'm very happy that I can be with you and that we can discuss this very important question at a moment in time where the pandemic is again rising throughout European countries and putting really stress on all the societies and also on the solidarity, on the financial and the political solidarity. So it's ever more important that we discuss the question of how we come out of this crisis together. So let me introduce my two panelists. I start with Ivan Krastev. I'm familiar with him. Actually, we are both friends, and probably you know, most of you, that Ivan has Ist heute schon morgen, is tomorrow already after tomorrow is the new book he wrote, a little essay of 80 pages. And to start with that little sentence that I captured from this book, there is a sentence in the book that Ivan asked himself whether the democracy can survive if people cannot be in the streets. So Ivan, welcome you warmly here in this discussion with us. I think you do need much more introduction. You're one of the most brilliant and most known European intellectuals from Bulgaria, from Sofia. You have been running the Center for Liberal Studies in Sofia since long. You were a fellow at the Institute in Vienna. I think you do not need much more introduction because you have been frequently teaching in the United States, written many books, and the last one is The Long Shadows of Liberalism. So welcome, Ivan, to this panel. And I introduce my other fellow peer here on the panel, Thomas Carothers. We never met in person, but obviously I know a lot about you. Thomas is a senior international democracy support person. He has been worked on democratization for years. He has a long-standing career in the United States Department in several functions before joining the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he actually serves as a senior vice president now. He has written lots of books about processes of democratization, and they regard the Middle East and Latin America and African countries. So Thomas, I'm very happy to have you here and that we spend together some 35 minutes in a discussion to get us out of this pandemic. What does this pandemic do to democracy, and how we can capture a moment for cooperation and solidarity. Let me give you, perhaps, Thomas, a first question to get us started more or less straight into the discussion. If the title that has been chosen for this panel, which is Saving Democracy, apparently then there is a need that we save democracy, which is we do no longer, or we can no longer take democracy for granted. And the one thing I'm concerned about is, why is this so? And since when would you say is this so, that even in Western societies we need to discuss about the very form of democracy, and we need to discuss how we save democracy, because it says basically that democracy is perhaps going to be lost. And this is new. To me, this is new because I was risen in Western society where democracy was a given. And it was clear that we never need to save it. We just have it. And everything we do, we negotiate in democratic terms. So how do you go into saving democracies? What is this little change and why does it occur?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here, and I look forward to the discussion. I think sometime in the early years of this century, people in many, quote, established democracies began to feel that two big things were happening. Democracy was not providing the sustained economic benefits that they thought it would. Western established democracies were built on the back of 30 or 40 years of continuous economic expansion after World War II. That stopped in the 1990s for a lot of countries and then got even worse in the 2000s as economic stagnation hit a lot of democracies. And so citizens began saying, it's not actually making my life better. So what are my alternatives? Secondly, people in many democracies began to feel an identity uncertainty. Their societies were changing. They often didn't really feel part of those changes. Maybe they didn't like migrants coming to their society. Maybe they didn't like sociocultural changes that were occurring. They didn't feel solidarity with people in the societies, but more individualistic, and they felt I'm not part of something. So democracies faced a double crisis of economic uncertainty and a kind of socio-cultural uncertainty about identity. And people began talking about, is democracy really my only choice? Maybe there's some politicians who promised me something different. Maybe I should look elsewhere for other ideas. So I think it has to do with some deep structural trends affecting established democracies that we've entered into what's really now quite a deep and extended conversation about saving democracy.
Okay, then I hand this question to Ivan, because I'm thankful for all this elaboration on the economic downturns and on, Yasha Monk has published extensively about these things too. I mean, there's a lot of literature in recent years and months, especially on democracy and why it's dead already. I mean, there's an interesting wording, the death of democracy, why and how democracies die. So there seems to be a little sort of mindset that democracy in a way is already lost. And I hand this over straight to Ivan. How would you go on saving democracy? Why we are so needy to save democracy? That's the first sort of thing I would like to give you. But perhaps you could also stretch it some further and comment on all this. Is it already lost, perhaps? I mean, have we lost the economic foundation of democracy? Have we made too many people unhappy in socio-economic terms? Is there a salvation of democracy? And what would it be to you, Ivan?
Thank you very much. I want to continue basically from where Tom started. And this is first, let's start with the obvious. The talk about the crisis of democracy have been with democracy ever since it was born. So from this point of view, one of the way to talk about democracy is to talk about the crisis of democracy. But of course, there is something new. And paradoxically, I do believe one of the something new is that the very spread of democracy globally created the problems of its own. One is what we talk is about the crisis of democracy in the Western societies, but because of the spread of democracy, basically the border between democracy and non-democracies became very blurred. For example, you have elections almost everywhere, but as Adam Przeworski used to say, democracy is a regime in which governments can lose elections. And you have many and many places in which basically there are elections, but the government don't know how to lose them. Second thing that is happening is that people, and this is particularly true for the Western societies, they don't have the feeling that they have lost freedom, but they have the feeling that they have lost power. And this divorce between the idea of your power, particularly your power as a voter, and the state of your freedom, I do believe also created the questions of its own. So from this point of view, I don't believe that the COVID-19 is the reason for this talk about the crisis of democracy. But don't forget, COVID-19 normally, doctors are telling us, was particularly dangerous for people with the pre-existing conditions. And in many cases, democracy was always the pre-existing conditions. There was a mistrust towards the democratic institutions. There was totally different expectations. And of course, this divorce between economic prosperity and democracy, which was experienced in many parts, and particularly among certain social groups in the Western society, contributed to this state of confusion. And this comes to the idea of saving democracy. To be honest, I don't like very much the framing of a saving of democracy for several reasons. Because I do believe that democracy is going to change. And it's changing all the time. And this is not what it used to be. And probably this crisis, which is not the crisis simply of the political institutions, it's a deep economic crisis. It also shows the vulnerability of our way of life. Is also going to lead to the certain changes of democracy too. So from this point of view, it's not exactly what you're saving. Plus, what is really, in my view, should be saved is a certain way of life. There are certain values, freedom of itself. So it's not simply about institutions and how these institutions should be saved, because some of the institutions can be changed, and it has been changing all the time. And one of the strengths of democracy always was that it was a kind of a self-correcting type of political regimes. It's not that democracies are not doing stupid things, but compared with the authoritarian regimes, they were better at correcting them.
Okay, so I step in here and I hand over the power. You know, there was the notion. Even talked you talked about power. It's not so much that we lost democracy or the feeling of democracy, but we have the sentiment there's no power, no grab of power. And I would like to give this back to Thomas because Ivan made two strong points. I think the one about democracy changing its form. And the other about this sort of sentiment of loss of power, that you can no longer decide things. And if now we are discussing not only whether we can save democracy, that is the panel discussion here, but also cooperation and solidarity in the aftermath of the pandemic, then there is a question of who would do that cooperation, who would hold solidarity, who's the sovereign of all these things. I mean, what is the location of the democracy we are all looking for to help us through the crisis? And so I'd like to hand over this question in search of the power element in modern democracies to Thomas. How does it sound to you?
Question from a kind of a surprising angle. Ivan likes a discussion that involves constant surprises, and so let me just keep pushing this forward here. You know, people have been asking me in the last 7 months, are democracies or non-democracies doing better with the pandemic? And the evidence is clear that what you really need to handle the pandemic effectively are four things. You need responsible, focused, consistent leadership. You need good state capacity that can formulate policies and implement them. You need social cohesion, and so citizens will follow those policies, cooperate and work together, and ideally some previous experience with health emergencies that you can draw upon. Now, what's interesting, those four characteristics do not correspond to political type. Some democracies have done well and have them. Some democracies have done terribly. Some autocracies have done well. Some haven't. There's no correlation between political system type and what is needed. And there's no correlation between economic level and those capacities. Vietnam is a much poorer country than the United States, but it's done much better on all four of those characteristics than a very wealthy country like the United States. And so, you know, people like Ivan and I have been in workshops and conferences for the last 20 or 30 years talking about, are you a democracy or not a democracy? Are you a rich country or a poor country? Along comes a crisis. And it says, I don't care whether you're a rich country or a poor country or a democratic country or an autocracy. What you need are these characteristics, which could be defined as effectiveness. That's what citizens are looking for, effectiveness.
Okay, so I push you a little
bit. Sort of throwing us and sort of saying, stop worrying about whether you're democratic or not democratic so much. Tell me whether or not you're effective. That's why citizens are going out on the street and protesting in so many countries. So I think this crisis highlights how we need to break a little bit away from the traditional categories of analysis and ask ourselves, what do citizens want and how are they going to get it?
Thomas, what you're saying is super interesting, and it reminds me basically that you must be a Platonian, because the benign sort of king who would know the good for the people, if you are reasoning in terms of efficiency and not about the form, how we get that efficiency. Is it by voting? Is it by minority protection, which are the features of democracy? But you have been reasoning here, and I think it was pretty good to say those countries who came good through the crisis would not necessarily be those democratic, but its criteria is efficiency. But what does it do to us? I mean, because Ivan, I hand this question over to you. If Thomas is right, and I guess he's right, because there are a lot of empirical data underscoring what he says, but what does it mean to us? Then we should admit perhaps the question that democracy, it's basically what Aristotle and all these ancient Greek writers would already say, that democracy is perhaps not the best form to be efficient, to do the good to the people. Ivan, is that a question that we can allow in the year 2020? With so much talk about discursive democracy, participatory democracy, I mean, it's just like, can we allow? Are we allowing this question?
No, I do believe we can allow any questions, and I do believe this is one of the charm of this conversation, that all questions are allowed. But I do believe basically what Thomas said, and I agree, and the empirical data also agree with him, is that if you see performance of the different states, the nature of the political regime is not going to be the one that is going to predict who is going to respond better. And from this point of view, David Runciman make a very important point that in the moment of a crisis, really dramatic crisis like the COVID-19, basically the states starts to resemble themselves. It's much more about efficiency, it's about the level of social trust, experience with the previous crisis, effectiveness of the states. At the same time, I do believe that while this is the empirical reality, one of the other aspects of this is that, of course, democracy is going to pay certain type of a price for this crisis. And the reason is that the model democratic states, the United States, they didn't do well. While the model authoritarian states, China did do well, at least for the moment, because don't forget, we are in the middle of a crisis with the COVID-19. So some countries that have been praised 3 or 4 months ago could end up to be not so good if we're going to look at their performance in 6 or 7 months perspective. So we're also talking about the crisis that has not ended, and particularly when we're going to see not only the public health aspect of the crisis, but also the economic consequences of the crisis, psychological consequences, basically what is going to be the mental health of societies after this. But I do believe that, and I agree very much with Thomas, that while on this level, it is not the nature of the political regime that matters. If you're kind of a non-political scientist, if you're just watching your television and you're seeing what is happening, one of the things that you're seeing is that the United States basically didn't do well, and didn't do well in a spectacular way, while China today has the highest basically valuation of its stocks. Basically, their companies are more valuable than ever before, because they managed to recover stronger. And this is an interesting story. But the second interesting story is that as a result of this crisis, we start much more to be interested in the differences between democracies and between authoritarian regimes.
Okay, but then let me.
Others not.
But then are you concerned? Because if Thomas, just one question to make this more precise. If Thomas says, and I also totally agree, that leadership and efficiency are the criteria, are you concerned that this could be a drive into authoritarianism also in Western European societies? Because there are some latencies to show this. I mean, this sort of behavior of the executives to really regulate things, the parliamentarians being out, not only in Orban, Hungary, but also in other countries where the parliaments have not been asked. I mean, there is a sort of authoritarian spin in the behavior we're managing this crisis. And if efficiency and leadership are the criteria, Ivan, but then also Thomas, are both of you concerned that there could be a little spin into a regime which we would not use to call democracy?
No, let's make very clear my position, because in a certain way I'm in generally concerned about many things, but there is also something that we should be very much careful what we're getting concerned with, because I do believe on the other side I was quite reassured that in a moment of a very important crisis, some of democracies really function very well. And you cannot expect that they're going to function in the same way they're functioning in the absence of this type of a total crisis. Somebody like Carl Schmitt basically always was attacking parliamentarian democracies, that they cannot function in a state of emergency, they don't know how to take quick decisions, how to take sharp decisions. And if you look at countries like Denmark, but also Germany and others, you're going to see that some of these democracies did very well. And this was the same basically with the United States during the New Deal and basically the Roosevelt period. So from this point of view, the fact that in order to effectively respond to a crisis, certain democracies can use policies that normally you're not going to associate with them. In my view, this flexibility is a sign of the strength of the democratic regimes and not of their weakness. So from this point of view, even the great example, by the way, is also the one that you referred to, Hungary, because this is slightly kind of a misinterpreted what happened in Hungary. So basically, Mr. Orban retired or sent to a holiday a parliament in which he had a constitutional majority. So where is the problem coming to you, to a parliament in which you have a constitutional majority? And if you go closer to why he did what he did, the reason is very simple. Exactly because the opposition was ready to support the government to adopt the measures that have been adopted in many other European countries in order to keep political polarization, which is becoming the major strategic objective of the Orban government. He came with this proposal knowing that it is going to be totally unacceptable for the opposition. So he didn't get more power than he had before. And this is quite important because you have state of emergencies in many of European democracies, but exactly because it happened in different places at the same time, and people can all the time compare what is happening in their country and what is happening in other countries, this type of a kind of a dismantling of a accountable institutions for the period of the initial time of the lockdown basically was out after 2 or 3 months, and you're going to see people protesting on the streets, the parliaments are back, and you have a new level of politicization. So from this point of view, I don't believe that the fact that basically the parliaments were asked to stay home for a while is the thing that should concern me most, because this was really a temporary measure.
Thomas, I'd like to hear you on this too. What do you see?
It wasn't the word I used, actually. I used the word effectiveness. Because when you look at countries that were really effective, it wasn't a narrow concept of technocratic efficiency. The government of Taiwan, for example, how many COVID deaths has Taiwan, a country of 23 million people? They've had 6 people die because of COVID, 6. Now, it's not because they're hyper efficient in some Germanic sense of the word, it's they're extraordinarily effective. What it has meant is a government that actually worked together across party lines, listened to the people, and developed, a public health response which was highly adaptive at the local level. Citizens immediately agreed with the national program and took part in it. They drew upon existing learning. And so effectiveness is not a narrow concept of efficiency. It can build in basic democratic features like working with civil society, like messaging effectively and being honest about what's happening, like bipartisan cooperation. So the good news is that actually when you look around the world, in general, the countries, if you took the 20 countries that have done best in handling COVID, probably 15 of them are democracies. And they may be small democracies like New Zealand or Taiwan, Iceland, etc., Finland, but they're democracies. And their effectiveness is because of their democratic features. And many authoritarians have done quite poorly in this, whether it's Belarus or Tanzania or other countries, in Nicaragua, and handling it. So this isn't that authoritarians are gaining ground in how they're handling the pandemic, but we have to worry about the meta-narrative that Ivan talked about, that China and the United States, if you just hold them up and say, let's debate democracy and authoritarian using these 2 big cases, that's what tends to happen in global political discourse. But unfortunately, that's a very poor reflection of the reality of how democracies and autocracies have done. So we have to be really careful not to fall into the trap that China would love the world to fall into, to say, well, here was the test. Democracy represented by the United States in one corner, China, autocracy in the other corner, guess who won? When in fact, the body of evidence would show that effectiveness in this situation, on the whole, has resided more in democracies than in autocracies.
Okay, so then I'd like to sort of shift the discussion in the next or last 20 minutes to the second subtitle of our panel, which is Cooperation, Solidarity in the Aftermath. There's a lot of evidence. I mean, if we say that this should be a global solidarity and a global cooperation, there's a lot of evidence these days that the global south is definitely losing out. The poverty of children is dramatically increasing. We have a lot of panel programs of the United Nations that have been abolished, the vaccination against Masern, all these means have been cut down to shift the money to COVID-19 programs. So if, Thomas, you had to answer the question how we organize, perhaps in a Western European, but also in a global sense, this cooperation and solidarity in the aftermath of the pandemic, a little bit what the United Nations wants to do. What would be your take? Because there is a deep concern that the pandemic is enhancing all the nasty trends we have been observing before, which is the global south, global north divide, but there are also impacts, huge impacts on social division. You mentioned in your initial statement that democracy is under stress also because the economic foundation is no longer working or the promises do not hold, but the pandemic will probably increase income spreads, fortune spreads just a lot. There are women and children being at the loose end of the pandemic. So what about cooperation, solidarity, and your take on these problems?
We have to be honest with ourselves. International solidarity and cooperation in the time of the pandemic has been terrible. Interestingly, this is the first major international crisis of this type that has hit the rich countries harder than the poorer countries in many cases. Europe has suffered much more in the pandemic than Africa has. It's interesting. It hasn't really happened before. Usually it's, oh, those poor Africans, they need our help. Well, actually, the death rates in Europe are higher than in any African country. Now, there may be reasons having to do with the youth of the population in Africa, but there are also reasons having to do with ways they've responded as well. And so the result of that has been actually not a whole lot of generosity on the part of the people who usually contribute to international response. Of course, there's the Western aid, but that's what I'm saying. So we have to start by saying this crisis has highlighted the people who usually help out a lot have needed help and have not done very well, and they haven't been very generous. The West, for the most part, has said, where can we buy the protective equipment? Where can we get the vaccine? Where can we? The response initially has been, whoa, we need to help ourselves first. And so it's brought out some of the ugly realities of the international cooperative system. And it's also brought out the reality that we now live in an age when China and the US and their inability to get along is paralyzing global governance responses. The WHO, the World Health Organization, has been torn apart by this China-US Guardian. It's pulled out, China has leaned in. And so what I'm getting to, Ulrike, if we need to think about what kind of international cooperation would be more effective, Europeans need to say, we cannot rely on the superpowers. US and China are not making global governance work these days. We ourselves are facing the same kind of stress under this pandemic as other places, and even more. And so we have to shift gears and realize that if we're going to be generous, we're going to have to find our generosity from deeper sources than we did before. So this is throwing into question a lot of our basic assumptions about how the international system is going to respond to global crisis.
I would like to hand this over straight to Ivan because I totally agree with Thomas. It was a proof of non-solidarity also to bunker the vaccine on the American and European side and to basically say we first, I mean, sort of this protectionist approach in the crisis. But Ivan, if that is true, if Thomas is right, and I think there's a lot of empirical evidence that this is so, what would that mean for the new international system? I mean, for the international system we will be coming out in. Is there still something alive like because we are, I mean, you wrote the book sort of, is today already tomorrow? I mean, what is the world international system? What will it be looking like in the aftermath of the crisis? Do you have any idea? Because we see a lot of features which are already there. There is this China factor and the stress of China on the West. There is this European position being totally squeezed between the US and China. There is this African momentum, global South, global North. Is there any reflection about the global system and the organization? That's our discussion here. The organization of democracy, of a global democracy, cooperation and solidarity. What do you make out of this?
Listen, I do believe that it was slightly more paradoxical, the effects. They don't go in different directions at the same time. Let's start first with the obvious. Not simply that there was no cooperation on the international level, but if we have this discussion 2 years ago, and we're going to discuss what kind of a crisis is best positioned to basically push governments to cooperate with each other, and if we have a war or great migrations and so on, or even climate change, probably we're going to agree that pandemic is something like this. It basically affected everybody. It cannot be stopped on the borders, so you can expect that the governments are going to cooperate. And they didn't. We're saying that people were not giving money to Africa, but even in Europe, we closed our borders at the moment when it started. So on this level, I do believe that we can be very critical, and obviously the reliance on the multilateral institutions, that the very fact that they're there, they're going to be used is not there. And I very much agree with you and Thomas that also this crisis simply intensified certain tendencies that have been there before, one of them being the rivalry between the United States and China. And because of this rivalry, you don't expect this type of multilateral institutions to be very functional. And vaccine nationalism and so on was very example of this. On the other level, we see three other things happening. One is I have been during the lockdown in the deep Bulgarian countryside. And the moment when people have been locked in their houses and apartments, suddenly they started to live in a big world. For the first time, all these people that had never been interested much in the world outside of their town or their country started to be interested how many people are infected in Brazil, how many people are dying in the United States, what is happening in Germany. So suddenly you have this kind of an opening of the mind of a person on the street at the very moment when basically he was locked down in his apartment. And I do believe there was this an important story, and suddenly we realize how much connected is the world in which we are living. There was quite a lot of solidarity on the level of families. And it was, in my view, every one of us was seeing how much, for example, the younger people have been very much taking care of their parents and really trying to lead the crisis very much through the fear of the older members of the family. And thirdly, even the nationalism that came in the first weeks of the pandemic was very different than, for example, the nationalism that was brought by the refugee crisis of 2015. It was not the refugees by origin, it was the refugees by residence. In a certain way, while the governments closed the borders, the migrants in many of the countries in Europe have been treated not differently than the citizens, because you realize that you cannot basically allow this to spread. So the moment when, for example, Portugal closed, they declared that they're going to treat non-citizens like citizens for the purpose of this. So there was also inclusion, not only exclusion. And one of the stories is that this crisis, in a way, is a crisis of globalization. And we're going to see some level of deglobalization. And this level of deglobalization means that social, for example, economic interdependence, which in our discourse was always the source of security, starts very much to be seen as the source of insecurity. We suddenly figured out that 180 of the key trade products, basically, the big majority of them, 70%, more than 70% of export, is produced in a single country. So is this going to change? For sure. So there are going to be these different trends. On one level, there is no solidarity. On the other, there is. And I agree also very much with Thomas that suddenly, because the United States was not to be seen, on the other side, China was much more aggressive. And many people saw the power face of China basically trying to use this pandemic for promoting its interest. As a result of it, you start to see how the countries are looking for ad hoc coalitions. When the German president basically in the second week of the crisis came up with an article in Financial Times, signed also with the Prime Minister of Ethiopia and others, trying to discuss how the vaccine should be distributed and produced. This is this looking for coalitions which are beyond the existing multilateral institutions, but they can be effective and that basically can deliver something that at the moment the multilateral institutions are not doing.
Okay, I thank you for this, Ivan, and I want to add and give that to Thomas as a question. But I also looked up a couple of data, and they confirm what you just have been saying, which is this sort of double thing that we can see in the data, that there is a rise of solidarity when it comes to the closeness. My family, my town, my neighbors, and there was, you can measure the rise of solidarity, also in terms of concrete help and financial support. But there is downturn data with respect to trust in national governments and the least in sort of global governance forms. So Thomas, what do you make out of this? Because if we see that there is both more solidarity in the neighborhood, sort of in what you can see, and a lack of solidarity in sort of what is not in your neighborhood, how can we then make sure that as an international system, and we are talking also saving democracies, that we come out of this with democracies organizing themselves and going into, for instance, sharing vaccinations? Because what we see, this dialectical sort of thing in the data would point to the fact that you are solidarian, but only basically in your surroundings. And that we will have backslashes, like Ivan said, in the system of globalization. And if we having backslashes in the system of globalization, in the economic features, then probably there will be a downturn on the way we run the international governance system today. No?
A question at the start of this session about power, following Ivan's comment about people feeling the loss of power. Because what Ivan was pointing to very wisely was the paradox of globalization in the last 30 years, was that the more the world globalized, the less individuals felt like they had any power. They were somehow more connected, but more powerless. And the push for deglobalization, whether it comes from populists on the right or the left or others, is usually reflecting this sense of this large global system took away my power. It gave me less choice in my economic policies. It gave me less choice in the society I wanted to have. And so it's possible, this is a pretty hopeful interpretation, that the deglobalization moment we're now living in produces a corresponding sense of individuals recapturing a sense of power at the local level, and therefore building some new trust in their institutions from the bottom up. And that democracy, if it's to be reformed, will only come about through the regeneration of a sense of connection and trust at that local level working outward. Now, that's possible. It's not the only outcome I can imagine coming out of this pandemic, but it's possible. Because when we look at the governance stress test that the pandemic imposed, it imposed the stress test on international governance, national governance, regional governance, communities, and families. At every level of our lives, the governance was tested by pandemic. And in general, the correlation was the opposite. The worst performance was the international system. Then many national governments got better, and it tends to have gotten better as they got down. And most people feel that their communities and their families turn out to be what they can count on now. So it's possible. You can imagine a political future of a regeneration of the deglobalization moment is a repowering moment for individuals and communities. But I don't quite know how we get there. It's a nice thought, but I'm not quite sure how we get there.
So I'm now getting the first questions in by the audience, and I'm getting them in by written. I do not get the names of those who post the question, but I have a very interesting question which touches straight upon what Thomas just has said. So I would like to basically read this question to you, and then you can perhaps just continue on what you just have said about the different levels of where you go in forming the moment of solidarity between the local and the national and the global. First question, we speak of the crisis of multilateralism, but isn't more precisely or more effective multilateralism that we need to overcome the crisis? I would give this to Thomas, and then I have another question which I would hand over to Ivan.
Again? Sure, I quite captured it.
But isn't it precisely more or more effective multilateralism that we need to overcome the crisis?
Well, we certainly do. We've been talking for 20 or 30 years about global governance and the need for improving global governance, and along comes a big test like the pandemic, fail. Okay, so let's put aside the old ideas about global governance, which were basically top-down notions about the important states cooperating on this or that, creating institutions that embodied their power and worked cooperatively. And it turns out, when tough times hit, that system wasn't good for much. So if multilateralism is to mean something real in people's lives and they can feel connected to it, it's going to have to look radically different. And it's going to have to be, something that is a kind of a citizen-oriented multilateralism. We see the glimmerings of it, because people do feel the kind of connections now to citizens in other places separate from governments that might build something different. And the kind of spread of protests that we're already seeing in the 26 countries in the last 6 months, there have been protests against lockdown. The actually biggest social movement created by the pandemic so far is an anti-lockdown movement that is quite sympathetic across different countries. I don't happen to agree with them. I think a lot of strange people in some cases, but it's notable that that's the biggest protest trend. It reflects the fact that people are working outward in societies towards something different. So multilateralism it doesn't mean it's dead and we shouldn't have the international organizations that we have, but they certainly didn't hold up to this test very well. And given that China and the United States are not going away in terms of their strategic rivalry, because it's a structural rivalry which is likely to get worse over time, if multilateralism is to really work, it's going to have to be something very different than the post-World War II concept of great power concert.
Sarcastic, but at least pragmatic American way to go over sort of checklists. We talked years about multi-level, multi-panel, multilateralism, and it didn't work in a pandemic. And so let's check it. Let's move on to other thoughts. I'm enchanted by the readiness to look at what is there, even if we say we invested perhaps in wrong features of multilateralism. They don't work like we expected them to work, but let's think about new ways. And I like your easy way to shift. And I would hand the second question that I'm getting by written to Ivan, because it feeds straight into what we are discussing here. And the second question is about this new invention and sort of what if the old things do no longer work, and what can be new here? And the question, Ivan, for you runs like, would it be better to create a new way of participation of citizens, for example, a partial right to, than to save the today's model of democracy that actually is going to its dead end? So again, we have a question that points straight to the something is dying, but something new is coming. Ivan, what do you make out of this?
I do believe that one of the impact of the crisis is going to be that we're going to see much more political experiments in different.
I don't hear you any longer. You have been freezing to me. You need to, I didn't,
Do you
were
hear
freezing.
me now?
Yes, and now it's good.
So I'm saying that basically we are going to see, in my view, much more political experiments. And this is particularly important in the moment when the public health crisis is going to turn into the economic crisis. And it has something to do with the fact that basically Thomas was pointing to. Because people got much more trust at the local levels of government, be family, be cities, be, by the way, national state compared to the multilateral institutions. And because the second part of the crisis very much is going to depend on flexibility. Listen, in the beginning, in March and April, when the pandemic started, the level of uncertainty was so high that basically first governments didn't know what to do, they didn't know what is the virus, they didn't have any data, so then they started to working with the worst case scenarios, and also they started copying each other. It is quite interesting to see, for example, in Europe, how quickly the governments start locking down, even in places like Bulgaria or Eastern Europe in general, where in the beginning there was a quite low number of people infected. But this was the right approach because when you don't know what is happening, really better work with the worst case scenario. And secondly, if you're not doing what the others are doing, then the voters can ask you a tough question if something really goes wrong. So from this point of view, the courage of Sweden to go on its own way is something that really should be respected, even if people basically don't agree with what has been done, because it goes and shows a great level of self-confidence of the country, of its government, and basically trust it's in all society. But this type of a copying is ending because now the societies differ. The number of infections differ, the economic impact differ because our economies are different, our societies are different. For example, in Eastern Europe, one of the biggest problems is a very much aging medical personnel and high level of infected people among this personnel. This is different than some of the problems other countries face. So then you should experiment. And because the governments are going to be under pressure to have results, under pressure to explain, using these protests, which are becoming much more important and meaningful, because just by being on the street, of course, most of these people who are not protesting against facial masks, but who go for other type of political protests, they're taking the risk of being infected. So they're making a very strong point how this is important for them. So yes, I agree. We are going to see much more and very different political experiments in different countries. And probably this is going to be on the positive side of the crisis. Some of these experiments can also fail spectacularly. So the fact that you're experimenting is not enough to reassure that you're going to succeed. But for me, democracy always was an experimental society. So going back to experimenting is positive, at least in my reading.
Okay, so thank you for this, Ivan. We are having some 10 minutes left, and I have two more questions, but two questions directed to both of our speakers, to Thomas as well as to Ivan. And so I think we can do a sort of last round, and I read you the questions, and then the questions give you both the opportunity to give a sort of last answer on this complex. And I think Ivan has a very strong point, but it's in a way Thomas is similar about it. Yeah, we come to the analysis that something we had in the international system does not work as we used to see it. And so we are in a more experimental phase. And like Ivan says, this can be very good and it's innovative, but societal experiments also have problems. I have one question who goes to both of you, Thomas and Ivan, who is in this token. So I read the question to you, it's a little bit long. While mentioning solidarity, and the question is from Matej Keka. While mentioning solidarity, I think on the micro level, this hypothesis does not actually work that well. Thus, I would like to ask both speakers, while talking about solidarity among countries, is there any correlation between the level of solidarity of population of the country and countries as such being solidar towards their allies or partners, etc.? I take this question and I hand it over to Thomas first, and then Ivan, and then we go with a second question and two answers of you.
Well, has there been much solidarity among allies? How reassured have Europeans felt in the last 7 months that their principal security ally is the United States during the pandemic? Has that made people feel much better? Probably not. So, the question of what's an ally is based on an old post-World War II conception of what the threat is. If the threat are, Soviet tanks driving westward, then you want a certain kind of ally. If the threat is pandemic or climate change or maybe financial system insecurity, you think about allies in a different sense and alliance structures and so forth. So I think, the pandemic is kind of like something that hit us on the side of the head pretty hard and said, you need to rethink your concept of security. I say to Americans, we spend over $700 billion a year to have the biggest, fanciest military in the world. Yet this year, we lost more people during any year of World War II. Did the military save anybody's life? If you want to save people's lives, maybe, you should think about that $700 or $800 billion a year and maybe redistributing a little bit to public health systems in the country, which are depleted of money. So, the idea of what solidarity is across countries is going to have to change because our sense of what threat is changing.
To Ivan, and thank you, Thomas, for making this point about the death and all the capital money spent into the military. I would wish and wonder whether the US next government will follow you on this. Ivan, what about the solidarity with allies and partners in this question, aftermath of the pandemic?
No, listen, I do believe that there is and this is interesting, both take contradictory impulses. In the moment of crisis, on one level, basically, like in the life of every one of us, countries like people can go selfish, but on the next stage, they basically can understand how important cooperation is. And from this point, the European Union is a great example. The initial response to all member states to the crisis was to close their borders and to try to keep the face mask for them, the medicines for them. And to be honest, in these first 10 days, there was not major reaction, major differences between, for example, Germany and Hungary and how they reacted. But then there was a difference, and the most important was that as a result of this crisis, the European Union did things that just 3 or 4 months before was seen as unimaginable. For example, there was the mutualization of debt, which was so much discussed during the global financial crisis and never happened back then. And then people did it now, and did it governments. And some of these governments were not the most cooperative or liberal governments that you can imagine. But I do believe also the small states realized, as a result of this crisis, that the idea of sovereignty does not make any sense if the look is going hostile. You cannot be sovereign of your own if you're a small country and when you have pandemic like this or economic crisis like this, and then you should cooperate. So the European cooperation that came in the summer after the first wave of the pandemic was not the result of the fact that EU did particularly well in the initial months of the crisis, but simply people understood that this is the only framework in which you can be effective, to use Thomas' language, and this is why there was a level of cooperation, and particularly there was a redistribution that came as a surprise for many.
Mentioning the solidarity rescue package of the European Union, this is not the place to discuss this especially, but as I have been observing this closely, I agree, it was the novum of the European Union momentum. I wouldn't talk about a debt community or debt mutualization. It's more an interest rates mutualization because it concerns lending, common lending, but already it's a step into perhaps a better future for Europe, although the fiscal transaction in terms of spending is something like 0.6% of increase. But let me go over to a question of Pristina, Artan from Pristina. And the question is also to both of the panelists, because we have been discussing the solidarity among allies and partners, and Ivan says that, or just told us that in a world which is going sort of competitor, which is going alien, or everybody against the other, then perhaps other questions matter more. And I feel like Artan from Pristina has a very important question, and he directs it also to the two of you, so Thomas and Ivan. I read the question for Thomas first. Isn't it probably the problem with democracy that there is too much globalization, in the sense that too many actors and layers make citizens feel too detached from politics nationally and internationally? And are there any alternatives? And I think this question points to many of the features that we already discussed, but Thomas, you want to pick up here?
Well, it's a great question, and it could take us into a whole nother session on the chances for democratic renovation and reform in established democracies. But certainly it takes us back to this question that started us off, which is, why do people feel so powerless? They feel powerless because they're part of a system where their own countries often have not very much control over things that happen inside of them. They feel powerless because national elites seem to be playing the game of politics for their own reasons. They feel powerless because decisions are being made that affect their lives greatly, which they don't even really understand when and where the decision was made to change their societies in these ways and so forth. And so it is possible to reintroduce deliberative mechanisms into democracies from the bottom and the middle out. I think it is possible that political parties which are atrophying, over time, give way to become different kinds of political groupings that are more fluid and so forth. Protest movements are becoming more powerful than political parties in most places, where we see systemic change, protests that turned out the government in Armenia in 2018, or in Sudan, or trying to do so in Algeria. They're incoherent but powerful, sort of informal social movements. So, the real action in politics is taking place at levels other than the national elites and the national political parties in most places. But it's just very disorganized. And so it's very hard for people to feel like, I feel a sense of where this is going, how do I attach to it, so forth. So we're in a time of considerable flux in democracy. But, if my last statement I'm going to make, I'm not sort of an optimist by They want a sense of power. They want a sense of choice. And authoritarian countries don't provide that. In most cases, they provide you a great deal of powerlessness. And so it isn't like there's some big democratic moment coming in the world. But what's driving most political systems is citizens' demand for meaning, for power, for a sense of identity, and so forth. And that's more likely to lead us to some kind of democratic systems than really tight, consolidated authoritarian systems.
Point. Ivan, I hand over the same question to you about this drive for civic participation and basically features of democracy that could overcome that sentiment of detachment that Artan questions here. Ivan.
Listen, there are different, of course, aspects out of it. One is, and this is quite important about democracy, is what we participate with in our democratic process is not simply our interest or our value, but it's very much our experience. And we're living in the world in which many of the questions that are going to be asked and that should be responded to are the questions on which we don't have an experience. It's not simply that the world scientists became too big, but it also became too complex. For example, whom to trust when it comes to the problem of coronavirus? When, of course, different views within the medical community, and this is what science is about, people disagreeing. If you're not very much trusting your government, but do you really trust World Health Organization? So from this point of view, part of the sense of powerlessness comes not simply because somebody else has taken the power. One of the paradoxes of globalization is that everybody had the feeling that they're losing power. Of course, the governments and the states have the feeling that they're losing power. But honestly speaking, even the big corporations and so on, if you're going to ask them how powerful they feel, I don't believe that they feel as powerful, because then they discover that they're depending and their power can be constrained by 1,000 people protesting or asking for boycott of their goods. So something has happened with the very idea of power, and this makes democracy different. And I do believe we should try to rethink it, because before you had the feeling that we know where the power is. Secondly, we know what the power is, and it was much more easy to take it. It was much easier to redistribute it. And then power became invisible. And this is why, by the way, conspiracy theories became so popular. Because when you don't understand what is going on, you're really trying to find a rational explanation. You try to find this almighty actor who is doing all this. And from this point of view, by the way, the pandemic injected even more confusion, because you don't have an enemy. Of course, the governments can use these metaphors of war, but it is not a war. And as a result of it, I do believe people are really trying to figure out what depends on them, what they really want, what corresponds to their experience. And they're going to be also, I don't believe that all good things go together. Even almost 10 years ago, Danny Roderick wrote a book about the trilemma of globalization. And he said, listen, there are three things that you cannot get at the same time. And this is integration in the global economy, sovereignty, and democracy. You can get every two of them. You can integrate and you can be sovereign, but then probably you're not going to be democratic, because people are going to very much respond to the pressure coming from economic integration. Or you can go for economic integration and for democratization, something that European Union was trying to do, but then you're going to lose some of your sovereignty. So the idea that all good things go together is also something that is very much challenged by this crisis, and it injects at a level of realism that particularly I found refreshing, because there was a moment in which we were trying to claim that everything is a win-win game. I don't believe it is, but it does not mean that everything is a zero-sum game, like somebody trying to convince us.
We need to come to an end. We are roughly 1 hour, but there is a little chance to extend for 5 minutes or so to have a last question or also a little resume. And Ivan, kindly, you included the lack of power, the vacuum, who was at the origin of all these conspiracy theories. So I do not, there is a question coming on conspiracy theories, but I think Ivan has provided an answer already. So what I would like to do is to give a last question in the round. together with a little sort of resume, which will take me 2 or 3 sentences. But I think what we learned is that there is a huge, basically, rethinking of democracies and rethinking the forms of democracies, going from an international or multilateral system which has worked in a given time, but which is now, with the pandemic, perhaps out of date. We see a drive for citizens' momentum. We see that in this vacuum, we are seeking for new forms of democracy. We are not giving up on solidarity. I think that has been very clear. I'm thankful to Thomas, who I think said it, that the very fact that there is no longer this multilateral driver does not mean that there's no eagerness for citizens' participation. So we are seeking no momentums for democracy, and it's not necessarily an authoritarian moment. But the question here is, and that is one of the questions which is still written here, if fascism and communism were responses to globalization, as Timothy Snyder says, then what we do with this sort of end of globalization or the need to deglobalize now. I mean, if there was reactions to former forms of globalization, and we see now that we are perhaps in the need to deglobalize, then what could be this shift around? How could we describe the current deglobalization forms and the current deglobalization forces? This question is for Neven Andelecik. So I give this into the round. I ask for rather short answers, although it's a long sort of theoretical reflection, this connection between the end of globalization and new forms of overcoming it. But I let go Thomas first, and then Ivan last, and then we end hopefully in some 5 or 6 minutes.
Well, I don't quite agree with this. The idea that fascism and communism were simply reactions to globalization, but that would take us back into a long discussion of the 1910s, 20s, and 30s. But yes, it's probably a deglobalizing moment, but it's still a globalizing world in many ways. And the technology makes it harder for us to deglobalize in certain ways. We can pull into worlds with the China world and the Western world and so forth. But the fact is, people are more connected than they were in many ways before. And so we have to be careful when we use the term deglobalization. We're not all going to be living in, sort of villages in a place with no contact with anyone else. It's going to be a selective kind of deglobalization. So I think we need to be careful with the concept of deglobalization. But I think in general, it's a chance. It's a chance for regeneration. All societies coming out of the pandemic are reviewing, what worked and what didn't, what do they need to strengthen. This is potentially an important moment of change. We've been knocked off center, and being knocked off center, and eventually the virus will be defeated, and then we'll have a chance. And so we really need to view this in a certain senses. There'll be many chances, because there'll be many experiments, there'll be many different things. How are we going to revive the cultural sector in different countries? How are we going to revive organized sports, which has been damaged? There's just a million questions we would never have dreamed of asking just a year ago. And what should our priorities be, and so forth. So in a certain sense, I think this isn't a terrible moment in the way that deglobalization could sound like a drastic process that takes us back to some kind of very elemental life. I think it's more of a huge opportunity for change.
Yeah. So also just to finish on a footnote, and this is that I believe that this pandemic and this crisis is kind of a crisis. It is going to have consequences. This is going to, because it managed to intensify many trends that we have been seeing before. And in many respects, it can even very much look like 1989, but there is one major difference. In 1989, at least we had the illusion that we know in which direction the world is going. And I do believe after this crisis, it's slightly different. I always remembered and like an old children's book that was telling the story of a certain lord who get out of the room, jump on the horse, and rode off in directions at the same time.
And I do believe we're going to see the world and the different regions of the world and different countries making different choices and basically coming with different experiments. So from this point of view, I agree, they're going to be deglobalization and globalization at the same time. We are going, for example, to see the shortening of a certain global supply chains, but we can see much more regional integration in certain places. You can see the proliferation of conflicts in certain parts of the world and also cooperation on others. So at the end of the day, like always, I do believe that the future is the invasion of unknown. So is to try to understand what we can make out of it and not to try to figure out in which direction the world is going.
Ivan, thank you so much for this. And Thomas, thank you so much. I'm very pleased for this discussion, which was for me really delightful. And I tell you why, because although we had a very, very difficult question, so the saving democracy, cooperation in the aftermath of the pandemic, what I take away from this discussion, thank you to the Belgrade Forum, is not so much anxiety. I saw a lot of analysis that we are ending up with some form of democracy. I saw a lot of pragmatism, especially with Thomas, who said, okay, that's the learning curve, but there are other things out there and we need to discover them. Thank you for this. And with Ivan, I saw also a taste for social experiment. But with the two of you, I didn't have the feeling that there's something like a deep anxiety that the world system, the global system, would not be able to do this. And actually, I'm very thankful for that takeaway, especially for myself. And we had a lot of and a good couple of questions. I'm thankful for those who asked the question. And perhaps the last sentence for me, just going straight to what Ivan said, which is this sort of what is the place of the social experiment with democracy? And it's just reminding me, because Ivan mentioned Carl Schmitt, that if you read Carl Schmitt in German at least, he talks a lot about die Verortung der Demokratie, so the location of democracy, where actually is the place. The local, the regional, the national, where is the place? Die Verortung, which in German resonates with Ort, the location. So with this, I want to end a very, very interesting discussion that I was happy and honored to moderate. And thank you to an attentive audience which posed exciting questions. Thank you again to Thomas. Thanks again to Ivan for an in-depth discussion. And let's hope that the global system comes out in democratic terms with a revisited democracy, with more participation of citizens, and in a global system that still can carry out solidarity and cooperation. Thank you to all for listening.